Hello, I'm Jenya DeLima. Welcome to Writing and Editing, the author-focused podcast that takes a whole person approach to everything related to both writing and editing, often taking its inspiration from the headlines and the warnings we see plastered all over social media. Climate fiction can echo those feelings of despair and helplessness. But how might our reactions to these fictional worlds and the world around us change if one of these stories left us with a message of hope? Here to talk about how to do just this, while also addressing the rise of ecological grief, is author and poet Dheepa Maturi. Well, lovely to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
For those who are unfamiliar with the genre or maybe what it's defined by, can you explain what climate fiction is?
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to actually tell you about the genre of the eco thriller because I feel like it's very close to what my work.
Mhm.
So if you take a standard thriller, you have an overwhelmingly powerful bad guy, you have a ticking clock, you have sometimes global stakes and global consequences, and you put all of that in the context of climate change, environmental degradation, then you have an eco thriller, which is what I wrote, 180 an eco thriller. So, and climate fiction, of course, is maybe the larger category, which also encompasses the more literary stories, in addition to genre stories like mine.
Mhm. And then what messages or endings are usually found in this genre, or even if you just want to look at just eco thrillers? And then also, why did you want to make a departure from that with your own book?
So it seemed to me that so many of the endings of these stories and the context of these stories were incredibly despairing.
Yes.
And it started to make me worry. I mean, I know that we need dystopian fiction because I think it helps us to mourn, it helps us to visualize what's going to happen. But, it really seemed to me that maybe these despairing stories are making us despair and they're making us say that, you know what, total climate catastrophe is a foregone conclusion. There's nothing that we can do about it. And it was really important to me that we add something to the cultural conversation, which is that, yes, it's a critical time, but we actually do have time and we have resources, we have money, we have so much ingenuity and technology. But what we're missing is the willingness to do that. But I felt like that was the piece that was not being talked about. And also, I thought there needs to be hopeful stories. There needs to be a story that shows that as individuals, we have agency and we have power as a group that we can actually have an impact. And I just feel that those stories still need to acknowledge like the magnitude of the problems that are facing us. But I feel like we need to not forget that because, as you said, despair is the thing that we really need to fight right now.
Hmm. And why do you think so many of those stories do have a lack of human agency?
I think it's because the problem just seems so overwhelming. I mean, whenever we talk about climate issues, there's always this odd disconnect, right? I
Mhm.
mean, we're talking about these giant scientific issues. They're proven that these things are actually happening. But if you go about your day-to-day life, it's not happening in front of you for most people or for people in the Western world. We are not seeing it happen in real time, and yet it is happening. So I think that that is the reason that these stories are really very necessary. For me, I thought that the issue of soil erosion was actually not being highlighted. For instance, we always talk about carbon, we talk about air pollution, water pollution, but people aren't talking about soil. But interestingly, that's maybe a more time critical issue because over half of the soil in the US has actually been degraded so that it's not producing the nutritional content that it did even 10 or 15 years ago. So I thought that by writing something that was a page turner, it would help people engage in an issue that was just so
Oh,
giant, but
yeah.
make it, in a story with a person who is actually dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. So
So how then do you bring about that sense of urgency when it is something that we don't see happening in front of us?
I think that that was something that was very much on my mind while writing the story, and that is why I love the idea of doing this in a genre, in a thriller, because you can compress the clock so much. I mean, that is the primary tool of a thriller when you're writing it. Your clock gets compressed, and when you think you can compress it more, you still need to. So the urgency was created because the antagonist of the story has created this chemical that he says will force production from the soil. And the whole context of the novel is that soil erosion has basically reduced the agricultural zones in the world to like 10 agricultural zones. And so he's saying, okay, well, I'm going to save those zones. So the problem is that that chemical is problematic, and that's what the data is showing, and that's what the protagonist, Bela Jeevan, finds out.
Mm. How did you explain this to the reader too, especially since soil erosion, it sounds like isn't something that most of us are even aware of being a problem?
Well, I just worked on weaving it into the dialogue, but making sure that the story took precedence so that people were moving along and trying to drop in the information in as delicate a way as possible. I know, I mean, this is definitely a message-driven book, so definitely those messages are clear, but it was intended for the story to be what propels people along.
And then how did you use dialogue to your advantage there so it still felt natural, like something someone might actually drop into a conversation, not this is dialogue that's being presented just for the reader's benefit or understanding?
I think it was by doing a series of like secrets, right? There were secrets that the antagonist was trying to hide and the protagonist was trying to find them. So as she unlocked one piece at a time and she's having a conversation with her sidekick, Chadi, a lot of this information was coming to light. But there were definitely areas because there was also an archaeological mystery, there was a mythological mystery. So there were definitely places where an older mentor had to convey some information. So, but I tried to break it up, tried to make sure that there was action interwoven with it.
Mm-hmm. And then how did you use each of these characters to your advantage then too when bringing that information about on the page?
So this was really important to me because there was so much cultural story and cultural context that I had that I recognized that other people didn't. So it was
Oh,
important
okay.
to me that the character of Chadi would have maybe a little bit of understanding, but really need to be educated and need to be given this information. So he was able to come at it from I have no idea what's going on, whereas Bela, of course, had the cultural context. So making them interact and making the information come to both of them was the way I tried to do that.
And then what do you think that readers gain when this type of different approach is taken, where they are left with that message of hope and not just despair or helplessness?
So I think it was very important to follow Bela's journey from feeling very powerless and feeling like she's always being acted upon, she's always being moved across a chessboard, and kind of making those certain turns in the plot, like at the midpoint for sure, and then like at about maybe the 75-80% mark where she
Mhm.
digs in at the midpoint and then really, really digs in with the assistance of what I call an earth figure. So I think that those 2 points were where she could make that turn happen and really find her own agency.
Yeah, just to dig into craft a little bit more, since you brought up the midpoint and that sort of thing, what are some of the typical beats that we would find in an eco thriller?
So eco thriller is probably not that different from any other climate fiction or regular fiction. You know, at the 25% mark, I think that that's when the protagonist, is kind of making a journey, making a big change from the regular part of her life that you've kind of followed through exposition at the first 25%. And then I think that the 50% mark is that point of no return. Like she's actually really walked away from her previous life and something completely new is propelling her forward. And then I feel like that 75% mark is when the protagonist has learned something and the plot is changing and it's becoming much more difficult, a resolution is needed. And then maybe around the 80-90% mark, you probably need to be tying up those plot events and getting protagonist to an area of resolution.
Mhm. And then did you plot these all out ahead of time, or is this something that you went back through and worked with as you were revising, or did it just naturally occur?
That's such a good question. So I'm a lawyer by background, so I really thought that I was going to sit down and write an outline, and every scene would be in there, and then I would follow it. Easy peasy. It did not happen like that at all. Not even a little. I started by using one of those rolls of butcher paper and like rolling it out and drawing maps and trying to figure out, okay, where does this part of the story need to go? Where does this part of the story need to go? And the whole lesson behind all of this was that this was just not a linear process. Writing a novel for me, and I know it's different for everybody, was not linear. I mean, I would have scenes that kind of felt like they downloaded, but they were not downloading in order. New characters would show up. Characters would die and they'd get resurrected. So it's all just very surprising. So I would start by mapping. I would try and move, get the outline into shape. and then it would kind of stop working, and then the pieces would feel like they were moving around, and I'd go back to my butcher paper. So it was a bit circular, but eventually, of course, I got to a point where I'm like, okay, I understand that at 25%, at 50%, at 75%, these are the things that need to be happening, but it just didn't happen as straightforward a way as I'd hoped.
Well, you're a poet too, so how did that help you while writing a novel? And then also, how is it different?
So I love this question because I love to write poetry. I feel like that's what I first wrote, like even as a child, because I feel like it just gets you to the emotional resonance of whatever you're thinking about or talking about. And I feel like that's what has been so important because I write, short form essay as well. I write short fiction. So I feel like poetry helps me to understand, okay, what is it that people are feeling here? Because I feel like that's what when someone reads a piece, that's what they're really looking for. Yes, they might be looking for information, but they're really looking for how has this impacted the writer and what does the writer want to say? So I feel like being a poet first has actually helped all of my other types of writing and modalities of writing.
Yeah, I can see that, especially when you said emotional resonance, because we still
Mm.
want to have some type of emotion elicited in our reader, no matter what we're writing. We don't want them to come away unmoved and I don't even want to say unchanged, but at least temporarily changed is kind of the goal. But I would think too with something like an eco
100%.
thriller or a climate fiction, we want that change to be a little more permanent. We want that to inspire action or even maybe a change in mindset. But again, that's not
That's exactly
possible
right.
without emotional resonance.
That's exactly right. And for maybe a harder task, which is kind of being anti despair, I think that those emotional beats are really important.
Yeah. So are there any themes that come up in your shorter fiction or your poetry that came up in this book?
Definitely. I kind of made a commitment to writing because I throughout my whole career arc, I'd been a lawyer and then I'd worked in business and then nonprofit sector, but I always had this I should be writing in my head. And about 10 years ago, I said, okay, this is it, now or never. I am going to make this a practice. I'm going to submit my work to journals regularly. So I started writing about culture and identity, but it was just very quickly, it was these ecological themes and environmental themes that became important and started to be really featured in what I was writing. So once that happened, everything else sort of followed. And then this eco thriller sort of emerged from that. I'm sorry, did I answer your
Yeah,
question?
yeah, you definitely did. And I was thinking
Okay.
this might sound at first like it's not quite related, but I know that you also have methods for alleviating doom scrolling or maybe stopping us from doom scrolling. But I feel like the two they go so hand in hand because a lot of this ecological grief I think stems from doom scrolling and looking at just the negatives over and over and over again. So I'd like to have you talk about that a little bit and then what you do for yourself when you find yourself doing that.
So I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of time indoors because I'm reading and researching and writing. And sometimes 3/4 of the day will go by and I'll say, oh my gosh, I have not even been outside yet. And I just feel like that's so important for me to just make sure that I am stepping outside, even for a short time, no matter what's going on outside, even if it's storming, even if it's raining, even if it's really, really hot, which I don't like. But sometimes,
I don't
sometimes I'll
either.
even, yeah, I know, right, I know. But sometimes I'll even take off my shoes and socks. I'll sort of stand on the grass, stand on the ground, and just feel that rootedness because I feel like that connection to nature is what we are losing, especially because we're doom scrolling and we're just on a tiny device and a tiny screen. I think we need to remember, and I need to remember, go outside, realize that my house, these four walls, that's not actually my home. My home is a whole planet. And I need to remember that I'm the bridge between those.
Ah, yeah. How do you think that also helps us feel better connected to what's happening in the environment, or maybe even care more about what we can do to change things?
So I think this is what taps into the concept of ecological grief. I mean, like you grew up with just this muse, this constant muse of species loss and landscape loss. And I just felt so terrible, but I didn't know what exactly it was that I was feeling. And
Mhm.
then in the course of research and writing, I learned that there's this term called ecological grief. And
Right.
it describes not just like sadness, but like this whole complicated array of emotions around it, like that feeling of like frustration and anger and helplessness. This is all called ecological grief. And having that label somehow was incredibly helpful for me to say, okay, this is what I'm feeling.
Yes.
And you might be familiar with the environmentalist Joanna Macy. She just passed a few months ago. And she had this beautiful way of talking about ecological grief. And she said that if you can just sit with that grief, just really, really sit with it, it turns to show its other side. And it's the other side is just this deep love for the world and for nature that we feel, but we're just kind of out of touch with it. And I feel like doing these things and remembering that connection, that is the key to moving beyond despair. Because when you feel that kind of love, like you have that love for a child or love for a parent, I mean, it's inspiring. It keeps you from despair. It tells you that, you know what, I'm going to do what's needed, even if it's something small, even if it's something for my household, even if it's for me and a neighbor, I'm going to do these things. And I think that that energy is what our despair takes away from us.
Yeah, I can see that. Is that something that comes up with one of your characters in the book at all, even if it's not directly stated and it's more subtly expressed?
I think so, in the sense that one of the concepts in the book is a particular school that's called the Tula School, and the Tula means balance. And the entire space, the school is this indoor outdoor space. So children are not necessarily aware that, oh, I'm inside, oh, I'm outside. Everything is this bridge. And I feel like that concept of having this integration and connection with the outdoors was very much a part of the book.
Yeah. So, how did the school play a part then overall in the book, or which character went to that setting and why?
So the protagonist went to this school, and this was actually a really important piece of the book because she started out in that school, living in that school, living in that integration, living with that sense
Oh,
of
okay.
connection with the school and with the environment, with the people around her. And then for the reasons that the plot tells us, she loses that connection. And so it provided this opportunity to show what happens when we have that intense disconnection, which is in a way the way many of us are living right now.
Right,
We are
right.
oftentimes living entirely indoors. We're living on our screens. We're spending almost all of our time there. It was meant to be illustrative in that way.
Yeah, that's interesting that you chose to show the connection and then the loss of that connection because I think that then gives her that unique background to look back upon and realize what you've lost versus having to discover there was something to even lose in the first place or that you've never yet built that connection toward.
Correct, because that would be a much longer education, I think. And I think here, having it, losing it was a much quicker way into the message.
Right, yes. So, how did you also keep the message from feeling too much like the reader was receiving a message?
So I hope that that's what I've accomplished, and it was intended. uh, I mean, I feel like it's pretty clear that this is a message-driven book, but I really did hope that Bela's journey from disconnection into connection, from feeling powerless to like digging in and finding her agency, would be personally resonant with people. I hope that she would be a likable, interesting, very flawed character who has this journey that we really just want to join.
And then do you portray her having realistic ways of expressing her agency or using human agency, things that the reader could perhaps replicate?
I hope so. I will say that there are a lot of magical realism elements in this book, but they are also meant to be illustrative of what can happen, on our human scale. I One of the books that I referred to was called The Intention Experiment by Lynn
Mhm.
McTaggart, and she just talks about how thoughts, intentions, attention all has energy. And so Bela is this figure who figures out how people's intentions can come together. So in that sense, we don't have the ability to do that. But I think understanding that our thoughts do have an impact on the energy around us and the world around us is an important step that any of us can take.
Right. And I think anyone who's been in a room with someone who's in a sour mood, or, we hear that expression contagious joy or a contagious smile. We've all known
Yes.
someone like that. And yeah, it is hard not to end up smiling or feeling uplifted, even if you'd gone in kind of grouchy. So yeah.
Right. And sometimes people are skeptical about that, but I always bring up like a sports arena. When your team is winning, I mean, that's some really contagious energy there. Everyone's really
Yes.
excited and happy. And I think almost everyone's experienced that, or a music concert or any kind of group
Yeah,
energy.
yeah.
It's
That sort of,
there. It's
yeah, that
there.
collective energy that builds upon itself. But I mean, even something small, like when a baby smiles at you in a store, it's one of those things where,
Yes.
at least for me, I can't help but smile back. And then you just feel that brief little spark of happiness that might have been absent before then. And it's just such a small thing where this other living creature is expressing joy, and now you find yourself expressing joy. Yeah, that sort of domino
I
effect.
love that. I love that idea and that experience because you're right. It's, I imagine a grocery store and a little kid laughing, and then everybody in that whole area laughing. I mean, I feel like it kind of spreads, and of course, the opposite can happen as well.
Yes,
So,
exactly. Well, so do you have any other tips that readers or listeners in this case could actually utilize for enacting positive change? Or if they want to learn more about maybe environmental crisis that's occurring around us right now, but in a way that's not going to leave them with a doom and gloom mindset?
so I like to say, let's start with ourselves. So I feel like that commitment to step outside. If you're a person who's always inside, you don't go outside except when you jump in your car, 5 to 10 minutes just outside in the grass, feeling what exactly is happening around you, being in the moment. I feel like that is an important mindset shift that should precede everything else. Because if you go online, you'll see, wonderful suggestions about behavioral changes, routine changes, who are the government officials to contact, who are the causes to support in the organization. There's so much out there. But if we don't change first, there's no way to engage with that. I think find your love of nature, find your connection to nature. I think that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is this: there is so much bad news out there, and rightly so, it's accurate. But there's also amazing things that are happening. And I feel like our news feed needs to also contain that. There are now bricks that contain moss that literally pull carbon out of the air. There's fungi that can digest plastic. I mean, there are people who are really working on this kind of technology, and there are laws that are being passed. I was just reading about how I think it's a city in England that said that any building built after 2027 needs to have solar panel on it. And what's interesting is that will actually result in a cost savings to everybody who actually does that.
Oh,
So there are these things that are happening, but we just don't see them. I think that we get caught in the bad news, we get caught in the despair, and I feel like anti-despair or being hopeful is a conscious commitment, and we just need to make that commitment. I think it's very important right now.
and then do you have any favorite resources for finding these other stories or these other announcements about these scientific breakthroughs?
I definitely do. I subscribe to one of the things I subscribe to is called Climate Action Now, and they have something called the Daily Dose of Climate Hope, which is just wonderful. Just a little bite-sized piece to start your morning. It's a great way to have a little bit of balance going through the day when the onslaught of other information comes. And there's also something called 15C.
Mhm.
They also provide similar news that's really good to start your day with.
Oh, good. Well, do you have any last bits of advice or a parting message for our listeners?
The first and maybe primary message is let's be anti despair. Let us not fall into that cloud of feeling that there's nothing that can be done, because there are many things that can be done and we can do them in whatever scale and whatever way that we are able to. That's what's important.
Well said. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes for additional information, including all of Deepa's links and a link for buying her book 108. And if you enjoyed today's episode, I'd appreciate it if you could rate or review the podcast on your favorite listening platform. Thanks again.